It doesn't look like a weapon. It looks like something you would lean in a corner and forget. A smooth stick, dark wood, sometimes rubber, sometimes metal wrapped in a simple grip, about the length of a forearm. No shine, no edge, no mechanical complexity. If you saw it resting on a desk, you might assume it belonged to a marching band or a warehouse supervisor. It does not intimidate at first glance. It does not impress. Compared to rifles, artillery, aircraft carriers, it feels almost embarrassing to mention. Even beside a standard sidearm, it appears primitive. There is no technology hidden inside it, no ammunition, no moving parts that click or rotate. Just weight and presence. During wartime, Americans carried many tools that were loud, powerful, and unmistakable. This was not one of them. The military baton was small enough to hang quietly from a belt or rest unnoticed inside a vehicle door. It rarely appeared in photographs. It was almost never celebrated in speeches. And yet, in certain moments, this simple object carried more psychological weight than anything larger. Most people would never call it important. It did not win battles. It did not change headlines. It did not redefine military strategy. But in confined spaces, in tense conversations, in moments where fear threatened to spiral, this unremarkable stick altered decisions before they ever became irreversible. The surprise is not that it could be used. The surprise is how often it didn't need to be. And that quiet restraint is where its real story begins.
The military baton was rarely the first tool a soldier reached for. It was not strapped across the back like a rifle. It was not secured in a holster with ceremony. It simply hung there, clipped to a belt, resting against a hip, tucked into the door compartment of a jeep, sometimes placed beside a desk in a military police station. It was carried by military police, base security, naval personnel guarding docks, and occasionally by officers responsible for maintaining order in crowded, uncertain environments. Not at the front lines of open battle, but in places where tension lived in the air. Checkpoints, rail yards, supply depots, occupied towns where language barriers amplified misunderstandings. The baton existed in that narrow space between authority and escalation. It was rarely used. In fact, its effectiveness depended on that rarity. The simple knowledge that it was there often changed posture, tone, and distance. A conversation that might have drifted toward chaos instead remained measured. A crowd that might have pressed forward stopped just short. Carrying it was not about force. It was about signaling a boundary. Unlike firearms, which introduce finality into a situation, the baton communicated something more restrained. It suggested control without immediately suggesting irreversible consequence. It allowed space for compliance, space for reconsideration. And for the person carrying it, that distinction mattered. To wear a baton on your belt was to accept a quiet responsibility. It meant standing in between tension and outcome. It meant being visible enough to deter, but calm enough not to provoke. Most days, nothing happened, and that was precisely the point. The baton was not there for the moment it was used. It was there for all the moments it prevented.
In wartime, survival is not always about defeating an enemy. More often, it is about preventing situations from becoming enemies. The military baton occupied that narrow and uncomfortable space. It was not carried to overpower. It was carried to stabilize. Its purpose was rarely physical. It was psychological. In crowded ports where ships were loading under tight deadlines, frustration could spread quickly. In military bases filled with young recruits far from home, tension could rise without warning. In occupied areas, misunderstandings could harden into resistance in a matter of seconds. The baton stood as a visible boundary. It signaled that order existed, that someone was responsible, that chaos would not be allowed to expand unchecked. Its power came from presence. A firearm changes the temperature of a room immediately. It sharpens everything. It narrows options. The baton did something different. It slowed the room down. It suggested that there was still time to reconsider, still time to step back, still time to resolve a moment without escalating it beyond control. For the person holding authority, that mattered, because panic spreads faster than force, and once panic takes hold, decisions collapse into reaction. The baton bought time, not dramatic time, not cinematic time, just a few seconds of hesitation, a pause long enough for a voice to be heard instead of drowned out, a pause long enough for distance to be respected. In many cases, that pause was the difference between a situation spiraling and a situation settling. The baton's greatest strength was not what it could do, it was what it quietly prevented others from doing. And in war, prevention is often the most overlooked form of survival.
In 1944, American ports along the East Coast were operating at a pace the country had never seen before. Cargo moved day and night, troop transports loaded under floodlights. Train cars arrived packed with supplies bound for Europe. Every delay felt dangerous. Every mistake carried consequences far beyond the dock. The men responsible for maintaining order in these spaces were not frontline soldiers. Many were military police assigned to manage movement, prevent disputes, and ensure that urgency did not turn into disorder. It was in these crowded loading zones, surrounded by noise, fatigue, and impatience, that the military baton became quietly significant. Imagine a narrow gangway leading onto a transport ship, dozens of young servicemen waiting to board, weeks of uncertainty behind them, an ocean ahead. Voices rise, instructions overlap, anxiety presses in from every direction. A firearm in that moment would have changed everything. It would have hardened the air. It would have made tension brittle. Instead, what hung at the belt of the officer overseeing the line was a baton. Not drawn, not raised, simply visible. That visibility altered posture. It reinforced authority without introducing finality. It reminded everyone present that order was expected and that restraint was still possible. No dramatic event followed. No confrontation made headlines. The line stabilized. Voices lowered. Movement resumed. History would record troop numbers and departure dates. It would document tonnage and strategy. It would not mention the quiet presence at the edge of the gangway. But in moments like that, repeated thousands of times across American bases, depots, and occupied towns, the baton helped maintain a fragile balance between urgency and control. And sometimes, balance is what keeps history moving forward.
Carrying a baton was not physically demanding, but psychologically it was different. Unlike heavier weapons, it did not create distance between the person holding it and the people in front of them. It required proximity, eye contact, awareness. The person carrying it could not hide behind machinery or volume. Authority had to come from posture, tone, and restraint. That changes the mind. To carry a baton is to carry a reminder that force is possible, but not inevitable. It is a tool that sits quietly at your side, asking a constant question. Will you need this, or can you resolve this without it? That question shapes behavior long before any situation develops. Many military police and base security personnel describe their role not as enforcement, but as balance. They stood in crowded spaces where emotions ran high. They managed fatigue, fear, impatience, and the baton at their belt symbolized the boundary they hoped would never be crossed. It placed weight on judgment, because once you carry something that represents a final option, you become more aware of every earlier option, every word, every gesture, every pause. In that sense, the baton did not amplify aggression. It amplified responsibility. It demanded calm. It demanded control over fear, not only the fear of others, but your own. Fear that tension might escalate. Fear that you might misread a moment. Fear that hesitation might be mistaken for weakness. And yet, survival often depends on hesitation. The baton reminded its carrier that strength was not measured by reaction speed, but by restraint, that maintaining order required composure more than force. Most people imagine weapons as symbols of power, but sometimes the quiet weight at your side is not a symbol of power at all. It is a reminder of the cost of using it.
The military baton worked not because it was advanced, but because it was simple. Its design was almost stubbornly uncomplicated, a single piece, solid, balanced enough to be held comfortably, heavy enough to be felt. No moving parts, no reliance on ammunition, no dependence on distance. That simplicity made it dependable. In environments where equipment could fail, where weather interfered with machinery, where supply lines stretched thin, simplicity became strength. The baton did not require maintenance beyond basic care. It did not jam, it did not misfire, it did not demand technical knowledge. It was always ready. But design alone does not explain its effectiveness. The baton carried symbolism deeply rooted in American military culture. It represented controlled authority rather than overwhelming force. It reflected a philosophy that order could be maintained without immediately escalating to irreversible measures. American military policing, especially during World War II and the early Cold War, emphasized structure and visible accountability. The baton aligned with that mindset. It was firm but not extreme, present but not aggressive. It also resonated with a broader American idea, self-reliance paired with restraint. In civilian life, Americans have long carried tools not to dominate, but to feel prepared. A flashlight, a pocket knife, a wrench in the trunk of a car. Objects that symbolize readiness without inviting confrontation. The baton fit into that cultural framework. It suggested that the individual carrying it was capable, responsible, and expected to make measured decisions. Its effectiveness lay in that expectation. People responded not to its potential force, but to what it represented: controlled confidence. In the end, it worked because it occupied the middle ground between vulnerability and excess. And in war, the middle ground is often the hardest position to hold.
History tends to remember the loudest tools, the weapons that reshaped borders, the machines that altered battlefields, the technologies that defined eras. The military baton is not one of them. It does not appear in strategy textbooks. It is not displayed under glass as a symbol of decisive victory. Most people would walk past it without a second glance. And yet it represents something that rarely makes headlines: restraint. Humans carry tools they hope never to use, not because they expect violence, but because uncertainty demands preparation. A seatbelt in a car, a fire extinguisher on a wall, an emergency radio in a drawer. The baton belonged to that category. It was a reminder that survival is often about hesitation, about holding a line without crossing it, about creating space for better decisions before worse ones take control. In wartime, the instinct to react quickly can feel like strength, but history quietly suggests something different: the ability to pause, to signal boundaries without immediately enforcing them, may be the greater discipline. The baton symbolized that discipline. It carried the message that authority does not have to shout, that presence can be enough, that power, when controlled, prevents more than it provokes. Most days, it did nothing, and that nothing was meaningful, because sometimes the tools that matter most are the ones that never have to prove themselves.